Welcome to you both. Vali, let me start by asking you the big picture question. I said that it seems to have suddenly erupted in Iraq, but maybe that's because we haven't been paying attention with all the other street protests. But what is surprising you about what's happening in Iraq?
First of all, you're right. It's not new. There were protests in Basra, and also the Iranian consulate there was burned over a year ago. I think what's surprising is that, first of all, that it's happening with the ferocity that it is. That you know, protests are much larger. The protesters don't seem to be going away. That it's becoming much more contentious. Secondly, that it is so easily directed at Iran and the militias that actually fought alongside with Iran against ISIS. That the militias that were sort of greeted as heroes, or the commander of Iran's Quds Force, General Soleimani, that was treated as a hero for pushing back the ISIS pressure on Baghdad, Karbala, Najaf, are now seen as villains. And I think that's a very interesting turn. It at one level suggests that the problems that people are facing are really deep, that the knife has really hit the bone. At another level, it also suggests that the fear of ISIS, the siege that ISIS had brought to Iraq, is being lifted, that the population is back to asking for bread and butter issues, and they don't feel that they have any debt to pay to Iran or to its militias and are holding them to task. And I think the U.S. absence from all of this is finally the other surprising thing. This is the first time that the United States really clearly looks disinterested. Even though this current prime minister was a choice of the United States and the U.S. stands to lose a lot if everything unravels in Iraq, it doesn't look like U.S. is engaging at all.
That is so interesting. Let me get to you now, Carl, from sort of a street and granular level, because first of all, you come from that part of the world and you are engaging with people on your Twitter and Carl Remark's blog. What are they saying and how are they engaging with you about what exactly is causing these protests, whether it's in Lebanon or in Iraq?
Well, I think, you know, I come from a generation that we had our own protests in the past, but nothing on this scale. And if you had asked me, you know, years ago, would you have expected something like this to happen in Iraq today? I would have said definitely no. What I observe and what I hear from people is the levels of spontaneous anger. This is not the traditional parties. This is not the traditional movements, both in Lebanon and in Iraq. The situation has got to an existential almost level of impasse that the people find no other outlet except resorting to the street. And at a much bloodier level in Iraq, because of the repression, much higher casualty levels, you can see people are still willing to go day after day. And we need to ask ourselves why. And I think a lot of people in the aftermath, as Vali rightly pointed out, in the aftermath of defeat of ISIS, they thought there's going to be a period of honeymoon. And obviously,
sort of the peace dividend that never came.
Exactly, exactly. And the chief reason for that in both contexts is the incompetence of the political elites, the lack of any economic vision, the levels of corruption, endemic corruption, as the squandering of the public purse and public assets. And I think this is leaving people, you know, marginalized to the extent I have only two choices. Do I emigrate or do I try to make my country a better place? And what we are seeing today, a resounding yes to trying to make the country a better place. It's not polished, it's not formed. It will get there, I think, in time. But what we're seeing is the first manifestation of anger that has been building up over the years.
See, I think that's really interesting, the sort of silver lining you're saying. It's actually the first manifestation of people wanting to own their countries and not wanting to flee. Now, in Lebanon, as we know, the prime minister resigned. And in Iraq, Vali, the prime minister has offered to resign but hasn't done it yet. We've had a former prime minister who's come out and said that actually he should be listening to the people. We have the president of Iraq, Barham Saleh, who's saying, in so many words, that the prime minister should be listening to the people and listening to the protesters. What do you make of the idea that, you know, this peace dividend, they hadn't seen it yet, which you raised, but also that this might be almost kind of a hopeful turn, maybe an Arab Spring 2.0?
Well, it is actually Arab Spring 2.0. I mean, the issues that Arab Spring 2.1 raised were never really resolved. And even in Iraq, there were street demonstrations during the first Arab Spring, and they didn't get anywhere. I think the young population and the population as a whole are frustrated. They still want dignity. They want jobs. They want better government. They don't want corruption. But the problem they're facing is the problem that people in Egypt or in Bahrain faced in the first Arab Spring. In other words, the protest is genuine, it's very powerful, it will force the government to concede, but it's not very clear that where do you go from here. In other words, if Prime Minister Adel al-Mahdi were to resign and elections were held, what would come after? How do you put back a government together, particularly because in Iraq it's very difficult to do. So some of those issues are there. There's not an easy exit ramp here, particularly in Iraq, as to how do you create better government. And I do think that right now we have the best opportunity now that the political class is scared, that is a bit shell-shocked, that it may be open to making serious concessions in form of changing the electoral law, perhaps revisions to the Constitution, which would dampen some of the sectarian divisions. But as I said, this is only the hopeful moment has to yet translate into something concrete if it's going to get there.
Well, I mean, you know, you put your finger on the pulse because actually the Prime Minister of Lebanon, as we said, did resign, and people are still on the streets, and they're saying everybody means everybody. I mean, they want everybody out. But I also want to pick up with both of you this idea of sectarianism, because I think people in both countries are fed up with it, that constitutionally, and you know better than I do, Carl, people are saying that why should there be, you know, these concessions made just because somebody is from one confession or another. And in fact, you know, you've written about this. Iraq's politics, you say, were modeled to resemble those of Lebanon's, well, to remodel. Various calls to consider similar arrangements in Syria. It's the struggle of the secular vision against the hegemony of the federation of sects will continue to inspire moves. But the secular version's lack of success so far should be a warning about the power of identity-based politics. The revival of universalist ideals is an urgent task today. Do you think, Carl, that it's even possible in Lebanon to get away from these sects and the handing out of various positions, depending on whether they're Christian or Sunni or Shiite or Druze?
I mean, I'm very optimistic and positive today. When I wrote that 3 or 4 months ago, I wouldn't have imagined what's been happening today. And just to put it in context, this is on a scale that has never been seen in the country before. From north to south, from east to the Bekaa Valley, you have people trying to overcome this confessional model of politics, doing politics. And it surprised even me. But what I was trying to point out too is this impasse that identity-based politics has created in the region. As in, it works on the model of dividing people and allocating the state resources according to confessions. You see the same being modeled in Iraq, but people are fed up with that because ultimately, I think what's happening is the return of the language of economic grievances. It's the return of class politics. And that's what we are starting to see manifestations of, not in a polished kind of ideological way like the old days, but in a much more kind of visceral manner that in time, I think, will manifest itself through the secular political imagination into an organized movement for change. That's my hope.
Both of these countries, Vali, Iraq and Lebanon, are heavily influenced by Iran. Lebanon through Hezbollah, and in Iraq, obviously, through the massive Shiite majority that exists there. So do you think that it's even a starter to think, Vali, that there can be a move away from the sectarian politics, again, where key positions are handed out and where it's very, very much identity-based? I mean, we saw that that was a massive problem in the emergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the emergence of the whole sectarian divide, you know, up until about 2007, and then it came back again.
Well, I think the problem runs much deeper. The problem is constitutional. You know, the Constitution of Lebanon, going back several decades, was built on sort of a confederacy of different sects and ethnic groups. So each of them gets a piece of the government, like the president is always a Maronite, the prime minister is always a Sunni, the head of the parliament is a Shia. You cannot actually put a government together without getting these different confederations of ethnicities actually agreeing on a government. And the same is now happening in Iraq as well. So I think the fundamental issue is there has to be constitutional change in these governments. Of course, there are going to be winners and there's going to be losers. I think in the case of Lebanon, it's going to be much more difficult because the confessional system is much older. And Hezbollah, you know, the Shias in Lebanon are not a majority. They're a plurality. And therefore, ultimately, you have to come up with a definition of Lebanese citizenship that doesn't include identity at all. So that basically means the whole new constitution. In Iraq, the Shias are technically a majority of the population. It's easier to sort of think of a constitutional arrangement that you would treat Iraqis with one man, one vote, and you would not identify them based on sex, and they would not be voting for sectarian parties. But in both countries, the difficulty is, can the protesters ultimately force an entirely new constitution on these countries? Because these constitutions we have right now, by themselves, foster and promote sectarianism, and then outside forces, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey, are going to take advantage of that because they can side with one sect as opposed to another.
Mm-hmm. I just want to follow up with this outside influence, because obviously it is considered that Iran was the biggest beneficiary of the U.S. invasion in 2003. And as you pointed out, whether it's repelling ISIS or domestic politics, Iran plays a huge role. And the protesters are angry. We just talked about how they've been storming the consulates. It's been said that Trump, in his maximum pressure and sanctions, has not changed Iran's behavior in the region, but that these demonstrations might, for instance, in Iraq and indeed in Lebanon. Do you think that's even possible, that Iran might get a little bit of a shock from seeing people in these two countries take to the streets essentially against them?
I think the shock is there. I think Iran is shell-shocked with what has happened. And I think Carl made a very important point, namely that the whole Iranian relationship with Hezbollah and with the Shia militias and parties in Iraq is based on the idea of Shia brethren sticking together in a sea of hostile Sunnis. That's the way in which this relationship would work. But as he was pointing out, you now have protesters in the street that don't want to think in terms of the sectarian or regional sets of issues. They want to think in terms of class and bread and butter sets of issues. And I think that does open the door for a very different conception of politics. I think that the problem is that if Iran can basically get a bloody nose in this, it can backtrack, it can make a concession. But if the protests don't produce a new constitution and viable governments, Iranian influence will be back.
Okay.
So it's very critical, and that's exactly for these protests to get somewhere positive. And that's actually why it's so shocking that the U.S. is not taking advantage of this situation and is absent in this current environment.
So let me ask you finally, in our final minute, Carl, what is it that maybe the West doesn't get about Lebanon or indeed Iraq? I mean, we're saying the U.S. standing outside makes it even worse. Iran influence makes it even worse. What do you see as the big issue that we don't get right?
Well, I think, historically it has quite shifted, because a lot of the role that we play, see the smaller regional kind of powers playing now, and kind of like Iran trying to play a bigger role in Iraq or Lebanon than historically would have done, have to do with the collapse of the traditional arrangements between the superpowers, right? And I think the US has taken kind of a declining, diminishing role over the past 10, 15 years. Within the region. Some say, for good reasons. And that is, whether you like it or not, is creating a kind of a power vacuum. What I feel personally is any kind of calls for Western support of these protests at this particular moment will be misplaced. So the call to kind of make them understand the situation isn't necessarily going to help, because it will add kind of a suspicion to why our outsiders are intervening in our affairs. And what we're really fighting for is more national sovereignty and decision on our own.
It's really fascinating. Carl Sharrow, thank you very much indeed. Vali Nasser, thank you for joining us from Washington with your expertise.